The Germans occupied Czechoslovakia on the 15th of March 1939, but the changes which concern the Jews in general and me in particular were very slow at the beginning, and it was all bearable because we weren't allowed to go to the theater or to board the tram or to go by train or things like that, but one can adjust to that. It wasn't too bad at the beginning, but it was getting worse and worse, and within a year and a half the rumor came around that we would be sent away somewhere. Nobody knew if it was true or not, but in October 1941 they started sending the first 5 transports, each of 1,000 people. At that time they sent them all to Poland, which we didn't to lodge. But we didn't know anything about it, what's going to happen there or how they will be treated. And they were sent away. They chose the groups of professional people like doctors or lawyers in 5,000 transports. And then there was quiet for some time, and then young able-bodied people were picked out, first men and then their wives or fiancés were picked out to follow them to a small garrison town in Czechoslovakia which was called Terezín, where there were only barracks and people who served the barracks. The barracks were evacuated, there were no soldiers there anymore, and we were sent to live there and help to build it up, which we didn't know then, but it became a transit place for all the Jews from Europe, like Germany and Holland and Austria, and first of all Czechoslovakia. Nobody knew what was going to happen because the place as such was much too small to accept all these people, so it was evident that they will have to be evacuated somehow. And what really happened, because as soon as they arrived, many of them died as they were old and weren't used to the circumstances, like sleeping on the floor or no coverage and no covers and very little food, and that was inadequate. And most of them died of old age and dysentery and things like that, because it was such a change from ordinary life to this camp life. But we who were sent there as first, we were young and able-bodied, and we were promised by the Germans that we won't be sent away, so this dreadful worry sort of didn't concern us so much, because we took care of the old ones who had to go somewhere, but we didn't know where it was sent. It was meant they were sent east, but where or how, we didn't know. I mean, we knew how. Either they went in ordinary wagons or in cattle wagons, but one sort of accepted it. I don't know why one accepted it, but there was no way out. And we arrived in Terezín at the beginning of December 1941, and at the beginning of January 42, the Germans hang about 15 or 16 young people for no good reason at all. They wanted to write to their parents, and they wanted to smuggle those letters out of the ghetto, which they called, which this place was called in the end. But there was no reason at all for such a drastic thing, because otherwise there was no shooting at that time and nothing. It probably, I don't know that, but it probably was a warning for us not to take things for granted or something. But it was just an awful shock when we realized that the Germans really could do anything with us without anybody being able to do anything. This is just to illustrate that after that we started to be frightened, because you never knew what the next day will bring. But personally, nothing had happened yet. The women were segregated from the men, but everybody lived in some other barracks. But I mean, that was bearable. There was nothing happening. And we were all working in one sort of another and sort of hoping that nothing would happen. And we had this promise from the Germans, which they kept actually for 3 years, that we wouldn't be sent east. But meanwhile, my parents came after a year, and my sisters and my little nephew, my sister's little boy, and well, they came to Terezin, and we had hoped they would stay there, but after they came in 43, and in 44 they were sent away, my parents and my sisters. By then we knew they were sent to Auschwitz, but we didn't know what it meant, because it was a name and we knew it was much worse than Terezin, but that was all we knew. And nobody else knew anything else, because it's something much worse than Terezin, but that's that. And as we imagined, as we have survived Terezin so far, so we weren't unduly worried. Of course, my parents were old, but my sisters were young, and the little boy was 8 years old, and well, they were sent away, but we couldn't do anything about it, and we never heard from them again. But even that didn't mean anything, because we weren't allowed to write from Terezin either, so that didn't worry us actually very much either. And then I became pregnant the first time, and that was the biggest crime we could have committed, because how can you get pregnant as the sexes were segregated and all that? Well, I am not going to explain to you how, but it happened. And there were about 5 couples in the same sort of under the same circumstances, who all became pregnant. The ladies became pregnant, and that was the biggest crime we could have committed. And we were called by the Germans to some meeting or something, where we were all highly pregnant then, and they wanted to abort the children, but somehow we made them not to. But they said, when the children are born, they will be taken away, and they left it at that. And I heard the word euthanasia the first time in my life then. I didn't know what it meant, and it definitely, the meaning isn't what they meant. I mean, they meant that the children will be killed, but we had to sign a piece of paper that we will allow them to take the children away and do away with them. Or whatever we signed, we did sign it, but in the end nothing happened, which has never been explained. Nobody knows why, nobody did anything, because we signed this paper. And there were about 5 little children, and one lady had twins, and they were all about the same age. My little boy was born in February 44, but he died of a natural death after 2 months' life. He got pneumonia and died, which was awful at that time, but it really saved my life, and it saved my life of my little girl, because we thought after June 44 that nothing can happen anymore, and we deliberately started a family, because we thought now it will be finished in no time and we will come home, and before we find our feet we wouldn't want to have a little child, but if we come home with a little child, so we will take care of it. That was a sort of reasoning which was totally irrational and stupid, and but that's what we thought. So I became pregnant again, and by end of September and beginning October, the ghetto was being evacuated, and there were only a few people left there, but this time the young ones and the able-bodied ones and everybody had to go. All through October 44, the transport left Terezin for Auschwitz. We were going in ordinary trains, but stuffed in like sardines. But anyway, after 2 days or so, we arrived in Auschwitz, which didn't mean much, only that it was a camp which wasn't as good as Terezin was. And we arrived at the famous ramp, now famous, everybody knows the entrance to Auschwitz. And there were these chimneys spouting fire and smoke, and the smell was something which I had never smelled in my life, and I will never forget it, and it stays in my nose all the time. I mean, I can recall it any time. It was different. We didn't know what it was. And there was this shouting and screaming, and we all had to leave our luggage in the train and get out. And there were German soldiers and SS men and people dressed in some odd uniforms like pajamas, striped pajamas, and in the end we found out they were prisoners as we were, and they were screaming as well, and everybody were out of the train and out of the rain, and you slowly proceeded towards the SS men, and there was one man specially, which we found out afterwards was the famous Dr. Mengele, who had gloves like gauntlets, and he made this movement left and right and left and right. Well, it looked quite odd, and we noticed that the people who went to the left were elderly people and children. They went to the left, and the able-bodied one between 15 and 35, let's say, went to the other side. But that didn't mean anything either, but we will see them later on. And then we were sent to some showers, real showers. We didn't know that there were other showers which weren't real. And we had to leave all our clothes behind, and they gave us old rags and clogs, and they shaved our heads, which was they didn't do us anything, it didn't hurt, but to shave your head made you feel sort of inhuman somehow. It was, as I said, nobody hurt us at that time, but it was a most horrible feeling. But anyway, we went through the showers and got those clothes, which you can't call clothes, just this rag and the clogs, and it was October by then, and it was cold and muddy, and there you walked through mud, and we were sent to some barracks where some other people were already. And I was with a friend who asked, "Where are my parents?" The people who were already in the barrack, and they started screaming with laughter and saying, "They are by now in the chimney." And we thought, all these people are mad to tell us things like that. But in the end they thought we were mad, that we didn't know and all that. But soon we found out that they were right, and that the chimneys was spouting our nearest and dearest ashes. It was just totally incomprehensible, because whatever we thought about the Germans and how they treated us, nobody expected that they would send live people into a gas chamber and then burn them. But even now, it sounds totally impossible to me that something like that could have happened. But one gets used to everything, and we took it in, and we were given one sort of mug or something for 5 people and no spoons, and the one meal we got was some sort of soup which was watery, and there may be floating some potatoes in it, but they were at the bottom, and if you were a novice in that sort of thing, so you took what you got, and we were so frightened and so shocked that we weren't even hungry the first day or two. And we slept like sardines on the bunks, which were 3-tier bunks, meant for, let's say, 4 people, and there were 8 of us there. And we had to sleep head to toe and vice versa. It was really quite something. And no cover, just a piece of rag. but nobody could sleep anyway, and we were nearing sort of madness or something. And the worst thing in the camp in Auschwitz was the roll call, because there was a roll call every day, twice, once at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the second time, let's say, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you stood for hours, and they counted, and if it was raining or cold, and you stood there hungry and frightened. And fortunately nobody recognized that I was pregnant, because that would have meant only one way to the gas chambers, but nobody noticed it because I was only about 3 months pregnant, and well, I was lucky enough that nobody noticed it. And the roll calls, we kept on running naked there because the Germans wanted to see if we were capable of work or not, which is all hindsight, what I'm telling you. And once I heard Dr. Mengele again say, this time it's a very good material, as if we were cattle being sent to the slaughterhouse. No, it was just awful, and you even didn't mind all those Germans looking at you and making remarks, but fortunately not personal remarks, only if we are well-fed or not well-fed, but nothing else, I must say. And after about 10 days of this constant selection and constant running around and being, our rows were, there were fewer and fewer of us, because some have been sent to the one side. We were still going to the right side, which meant not gas chambers. And you know, at those moments, if you go this way and the others go that way, you felt, aren't I glad it's not me? I mean, no compassion, nothing. You just thought you were lucky not to have to go that way. And then on the 10th day of our stay in Auschwitz, we were sent to some barracks which we had never seen before. And that was the first time really I thought, well, this is it. But it wasn't it, because we were given some food and some other clothes, but still as beautiful as the ones before, and some other clothes. And we were sent away to board a train. We didn't know where to go, but we were sent away from Auschwitz, and we knew it can't get any worse, and we were right in that respect. We were put into cattle wagons, but that didn't matter, and again squeezed in, I don't know how many in one wagon, and no food and no water and nothing, but we were as happy as can be, which is all relative, because we left that dreadful place and we were going westwards, which means sort of to Europe somewhere, not to Poland or Russia or whatever. And after about 2 days, actually we suffered a terrible thirst because there was no water. And I'm just branching off, but to tell you that cold is dreadful and hunger is dreadful, but thirst is unbelievable. It really is the worst of these three, which I wouldn't have believed, but I mean, well, anyway, this is just en passant. It was awful and we were thirsty, but it didn't matter. The train stopped and we were screamed at to get out of the train. And we were going, sort of marching through the town which was called Freiberg, which is in Lower Saxony, just beyond the Czech frontier, actually, very near Dresden. And we came to that factory which was on a top of a hill, and it was warm in there, and we thought it's warm and that's marvelous, and it was, our quarters were in the factory as well, and there were thousands of bed bugs, which we were glad to see, because that meant it's warm and there is food about, because otherwise they wouldn't have been there. Well, this was all magnificent in comparison to what we went through, and we were given some very bad and little food, but still it was better than Auschwitz. Nothing compares with Auschwitz. And we started working in this factory, which we didn't know what we were doing, because we were riveting, which looked like an tailpiece of an aeroplane, but for that it was too small. And as we had never seen a riveting machine in our lives, so you can imagine it wasn't very perfect what we are doing. And we thought, they can't put a pilot in this aeroplane, it will disintegrate. Of course, we didn't know that they were the V1s, which were called here doodlebugs, the pilotless bombs. But we found all that only after the war, because so we were making something which was very vital for the Germans. We knew that, but we possibly couldn't imagine anything like that being made. Well, anyway, that's neither here nor there, and we were riveting and working 14 hours a day. And then they started building barracks outside the town for us to live there, because the factory couldn't take us anymore. And that wasn't so nice, but we had to walk through town, and the people in Freiberg weren't all that pleased to see us, because we must have looked like scarecrows, and they really didn't know what to make of it. Well, it was awful to walk through that place every morning or every night, as it depended on the shifts. And by then it was end of January 45, and they sort of found out that I was pregnant, but by then they couldn't send me back because Auschwitz didn't exist anymore, which saved my life and the life of my child. And I was given sort of a lighter work, I don't know why, which meant that I swept the factory floor and the staircases for 14 hours a day. And when I finished, I started sweeping again. Well, I didn't mind doing that, but 14 hours is long, and if you are hungry and cold, apart from walking from that outside town back to the factory, but nobody did anything to me, and it was bearable. And after Auschwitz, everything was bearable. And by the spring, by actually the beginning of April of 45, I was by then in the 9th month of pregnancy, and Roosevelt died. And the Americans were already nearing the camp. No, I forgot something. May I go back a little bit? Because in February 45, there was this famous Dresden raid, which we saw from the factory. We were about 10 miles away. The Germans locked us in and went to a cellar, and we were sitting in this munitions factory on a hill, and the aeroplanes flying over us, but not one bomb fell down. They were all going to Dresden, and I must say that that was the most magnificent fireworks I had ever seen in my life, and we cheered, and it was fantastic. Because next day the few people who worked, the Germans who lived in Dresden and worked in our factory, came absolutely flabbergasted what had happened to Dresden, and we loved every minute of it. And the next day there was the next raid, and it really was magnificent. And ever since I found out that Bomber Harris arranged that, I have adored him, because it was fantastic. And to tell people that Dresden was an open city without munition factories, this is all rubbish. It was all camouflage, and it should have been destroyed, and it was destroyed. And you may not agree with me, but for us it was such a boost that you can't imagine anything else. Well, I had to go back, but now I was back in April, and we were put into coal wagons which were open and full of dirt and muck and soot. And they really didn't know where to take us. We crossed the Czechoslovak frontier, and we had hoped, which didn't materialize, that we were going back to Terezin, which was very near there. But we stopped at a siding in a little sort of village where we stood for about a fortnight or we stood there about 10 days, and then we started moving again, and there was no sanitation, no food. And we must have looked aside, because you couldn't get rid of the soot which you had to sit in or lie in, and there was no way of washing. Well, anyway, we traveled south in Bohemia, and when we approached Budweis, which is the southern part of Bohemia, so we knew we can't go anywhere else but to Austria, where there was this one concentration camp, Mauthausen, which was on the par with Auschwitz, which we knew. Well, there was nothing to be done about it, and we arrived in Auschwitz on the 29th of April, and when I saw it written down, Mauthausen, I started to have a baby. And we arrived, and everybody had to get out of the train, and the people who were ill or who couldn't walk, like I was one of them, were put on a cart which was pushed up because the camp proper was on a hill on top of the place. I don't know how we were propelled up, that I have forgotten, but we arrived in the proper camp, and there I had to change from one cart to another cart, which took me down again to the so-called hospital, which every concentration camp had a hospital which was called Revier. What that meant or didn't mean, I don't know, but that's what it was called. And we were going downhill again, and the baby started to come, and the baby sort of slipped out and didn't move and didn't cry, and I was on that cart with about 30 other women who were in the last stages of dying with typhus and God knows what not, and lice crawling around in thousands, but I somehow didn't take any of that in, and we arrived in that outside that hospital, and they called a doctor who happened to be a gynecologist, and he cut the umbilical cord and took the baby and got it to breathe and to cry, and said, "You have got a little boy." Fine, I had a little boy, and that as there was nothing for the baby to be wrapped in, so there were some newspapers, and the baby was wrapped in newspapers, and I held it, and I was delighted it's there. And the Germans by then were very small, because they blew up the gas chamber the day before, so they didn't do anything to me, but on the contrary, they could have killed me with their bringing me food and something to eat. After 3 weeks, having got a piece of bread somewhere or something, but no proper food really, and in a state I was in, I mean, the infection would have been rampant. Well, anyway, nothing happened, and I survived that with dreadful diarrhea and all that, which could have really killed me. And I had milk for the baby as if I had been fed, I don't know what. And after about 3 days, the Americans came and liberated us. So I had 3 days under the Germans there, but by then they were really frightened and tried to run away, and did run away. And the danger to be killed had disappeared. But after, there was a little nurse running around us when the Americans arrived already, and I asked her to take a look at my little boy, because he hasn't been changed for I don't know how long, and if she could do something about it. And she looked at me and said, "But it's a little girl." I said, "You must be mad." And then I started to be hysterical. There were a lot of doctors around. Everybody came to have a look at my little girl, a little child, little baby, and they discovered that, said that a mistake like that could be made, because either as the baby was so small, she was only about 3 pounds, and I was 5 stone at that time, that if the baby is very small, either the sexual organs are overdeveloped or underdeveloped, and a mistake can be made. I don't know if it's true, but that's what I was told. Well, I was delighted actually because I wanted a little girl, and I had a little girl, and as I said, I could feed her quite easily. And after about a fortnight, we were sent back to Prague, not before the fortnight because there was a revolution in Prague, but after a fortnight we were put on the coaches and sent to Budweis again on the way back, where we dismounted from the train and were put on coaches and sent back to Prague, and arrived in Prague very late in the evening. And that was actually the worst moment of the whole war for me, because all the time you don't think about it, what you won't find. You think, I am going home. And there was no home and nobody there. And the first time you realized you came into nothing. And there was no light at the station and nobody waiting for us, and nobody sort of, you stood there like unreal. But as I personally didn't have anywhere to go, and there were quite a few of us who didn't know where to go, so the Red Cross took care of it and sent us overnight, or took us to a hotel where we stayed the night. And in the morning, which was a Sunday, the 19th of May 1945, I came downstairs and asked the porter if he could give me some money for the tram, because obviously I didn't have any money. Well, everybody gave me some money who was there, and I was the first returned prisoner of war, or whatever you want to call it, whom they had seen, because no hair or very short hair, and in these pajama striped things which I had on, and this little baby in my arms. It must have been quite a sight. And I boarded the train, and because there was one place I thought I could go to, my cousin who was Jewish but married to a non-Jew, and they didn't get divorced, and I thought, this is the one person who may be here. And I arrived to their flat, and I rang the bell, and the whole family, meaning the husband and the wife and their 2 growing up children, were waiting for me. Through some grapevine, I was in Prague for about 10 hours, or not more than that, and they knew I was coming, and they gave me a welcome like to a queen, and I begged them if I could stay for about 3 days until I find my feet or something. And in the end I stayed 3.5 years, and they were like angels to me all this time. And they replaced my family, whom I knew I will never see again. And very soon I found out that I won't see my husband again either, because I met somebody who was there when the Germans just were shooting haphazardly, and my husband was shot like that already at the end of April 1945.
And what are your feelings towards those who did this to you and your family?
Well, the people whom you are mentioning are actually the Germans of my generation, whom I will never ever forgive what they had done to, not so much to me, but to kill all my family and to kill the father of my child. And I will hate them until I die, but that doesn't mean that everybody has to make their own have their own opinions. I can't influence it. I don't want to influence it, but this is my personal point of view.
Do you believe in God?
Well, again, I don't want to influence anybody, or I don't want to offend anybody. I don't believe in God, because where was he?
There are those who believe that God was there in Auschwitz alongside his suffering people. What do you think of that?
Nothing. We had to fight it ourselves, and nobody helped us. And if he allowed things to happen as they did happen, so, well, I don't believe in that. But in my experience, either you came out as a non-believer or as a deep believer. There is no happy medium, sort of wishy-washy. That doesn't exist after this experience. And I met quite a few people who really believe. I mean, Jewish prisoners who went through similar things like I did, or more or less. Well, everybody turns either this way or that way, and I turned that way. But I was brought up in a very non-religious home, so I was very near to what happened in the end. I don't want to excuse anything. That's what happened.
How do those Jewish people with belief cope with and understand the Holocaust?
Well, this is a very deep question which I can try to answer a little bit, because I don't know if you know about the place Beth Shalom, where actually I was at a lecture which my daughter was giving there, and there was a group of Orthodox Jews from London who came for that purpose, really deeply believing people. And she gave her talk and she told them our story, and actually told them that I was in the audience, and she's a good-looking woman with children who are in their 30s now, and everything seems to be all right. And these people started to question me because I was pointed out to them, and I told them more or less what they wanted to know, and of course this inevitable question came. And I said, I don't want to offend anybody, and I appreciate, and so on, but I don't believe in God. I told this very religious group, and they took it like lambs, and nobody objected or don't criticized anything. And in the end, after the lecture and the question time, one of those gentlemen came to me, much older than I, very nice, very polite, very pleasant. And he said, but look at your daughter, here she is, and look at yourself, here you are, healthy and well off and fine and everything perfect. So how do you think it happened? And I dared answer him that he calls it God and I call it luck. That's all the difference there is in this expression. What he puts in it and what I put in it is totally different, but in the end it's just a matter of what you call it. He took it like a lamb, he kissed my cheek and wished me luck, and that was that. He didn't take offense, and I said it as nicely as I could, but I did admire him really.